Welcome to the Spirit of Truth video podcast. I'm Derek Samaras. Today we have Halbert Katzen. He's going to fill us in on all of his work and projects that are coming up, as well as maybe we'll get into some risky topics such as conspiracy and whatnot. Stick with us. This is the Spirit of Truth podcast. Welcome back to the podcast. This is the Spirit of Truth podcast. And with us today is Halbert Katzen. Thanks for joining us, Halbert. It's a pleasure to have you here. A little bit of serendipity that you got to join us. We're really lucky that you were coming through Colorado, and thanks for joining us, man. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very appreciative of the serendipity also. It really is a great sign of the times, you might say. Not to, foreshadow or anything, but it was right there and I couldn't resist.
Yeah, well, I've always been a fan of your work. We've gotten to meet in person a few times. Last time I think we really got to sit down and hang out was at IC17 here in Denver in the Colorado area. And that was an interesting time. That was when the eclipse happened on August 21st, 2017. And I know a lot of people were looking at that as kind of a catalyst for some,
if I could interrupt, we
Please.
should say Jesus' birthday, August 21st, for people tuning in who may not be familiar,
Yeah, absolutely.
If someone's not that versed in the Urantia book, that's where the intrigue starts, is right there on Jesus' birthday, we've got a full solar eclipse.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. I take it for granted how steeped I am in the Urantia book and the Urantia revelation, and I'm privileged with speaking with so many scholars and people who've been reading the book for 40 plus years, some 60, 70 years. So I know a lot of people have done a lot of research in this, but to the people who are at home who maybe aren't as versed in the Urantia book, do you think maybe you could talk us through the significance of August 21st and how that ties in with this eclipse and perhaps some things that are foreshadowing, perhaps?
Sure.
Thanks.
So basically what happened is some events snuck up on the community of Urantia book readers. And the two events are the one we just mentioned, the August 21st, 2017 full solar eclipse in the United States that went from the West Coast to the East Coast, and happens to be on the day that the Urantia book says is Jesus' birthday. And that really wasn't too much on anyone's radar, it seemed, until we got pretty close to that event. And then with that, a Urantia book reader got in touch with me who informed me that, in fact, on April 8th, 2024, we're due for a second full solar eclipse in the United States that goes from Texas up to Maine, and it crisscrosses the path of the first one within 10 miles of a place called the Bald Knob Cross of Peace, which is a 111-foot cross built by a group of interdenominational Christians who had been celebrating Easter sunrise services there, and with such enthusiasm and duration, they thought,
just so we're clear,
why not build a cross?
That's in Illinois, right?
That's in southern Illinois, yes.
Southern Illinois. Okay.
Yeah, in the Shawnee National Forest area, which is noteworthy. It's noteworthy because the Urantia book has a paragraph about prophets where it says that in any generation amongst any people, when general education and scientific progress is thwarted, then prophets will arise in those circumstances. Those are the social circumstances in which prophets arise. And the Urantia book is basically explaining how this is part of the grace of God and the balancing energies, that occur in order to keep us all moving forward. And it says that evidence of this is an example. Tenskwatawa, the Shawnee prophet, predicted the eclipse of 1806. That is a whole interesting story in itself. Tenskwatawa can be looked up on Wikipedia.
Right,
He predicted an eclipse. He was denounced. The eclipse occurred, and it was a kind of denouncing that was a Christian type denouncing. That's one of the things that's very interesting about it.
So like calling it pagan or something like that?
No, it was more like just coming from more that Christian tradition of make the sun and the moon stand still, and appealed to Tenskwatawa to, show his power as a prophet by, making the sun stop in its path or something like that. So he did a full solar eclipse.
Right.
And predicted it about 50 days out, I think, or so.
Cool.
And so interestingly enough, that's in the Urantia book and relates right to where these two eclipses crisscross. And I would want to mention at this juncture that we're living in a country where Christianity, or segments of it at least, has demanded that the world is 6,000 years old and all scientific understandings to the contrary are bogus. And we've seen general education in this country decline for decades. So it's very interesting how all of that relates to our very own country.
Right.
And
so are you implying then that it's the signs of the times are showing that it's time for a new prophet?
Well, I think there's an obvious connection to make there, for sure. But exactly how these prophets might show up and whether they perhaps already have in certain ways is a question in itself. So, for instance, on the UB Annotated website, I've got annotations to the work of Joseph Newman, who built an energy machine and applied for a patent and was rejected and sued the federal government to get the patent. And it led to quite a story because the special master, the expert hired by the judge to review this, was a former patent commissioner, head of the patent office, appointed by the president, impeccable credentials. And he came back and said, there's overwhelming evidence to support giving this man a patent. So the judge said, essentially, that's not the right answer. We'll give this to the National Bureau of Standards and let them check it out and see if they come back with a better answer. At the National Bureau of Standards, they grounded his machine when they tested it, which is specifically not what you're supposed to do. And they were instructed, of course, that way. And it screws up how the machine operates and doesn't give you the results. So they grounded it and then wrote back to the judge that it doesn't work. And right answer. And so this is just one example. I mean, because Joseph Newman absolutely felt like he was serving God, and he was constantly explicit in his message that I am here to serve humanity and bring this technology forward to humanity. So there's lots of different ways to look at this, I guess is what I'm saying, and I don't have any particular answers in terms of it clearly leads here or there, but I've been incredibly intrigued by the whole line of study and where it's led me and the inquiries that, come up just by doing what set me off about 10 or more, 12 years ago now with the UB The News Project.
Right.
My first efforts with documenting things of interest related to the Urantia book was when I was documenting how new discoveries and scientific advances seem to have a pattern of increasingly supporting the history in the Urantia book. And the Urantia book puts its credibility on the line that way by saying that the history will stand the test of time. Yeah,
let's talk about that real quick for a second, because I'm curious as to when did you decide, okay, I want to get academic and have credibility with this Urantia book, in particularly part 3 that talks about the history of our planet. That was it a process for you personally that you felt, I don't believe this, so I'm going to debunk it? Or was it that I'm curious and I'm like, I want to know more and find out more?
It was more of a flash of understanding for me personally. That getting the UB the News project started is a peculiar and long story, that definitely relates to things that were happening in that time period that are easy to summarize and very much worth noting, which is that there were people before me who were doing similar types of work, and their inspiration and progress made it very easy for me to focus in on advancing this work further. There's nothing especially creative about what I did, except that I took it in the direction of outreach. And prior to that, the conversations were more for believers, self-affirming conversations of their own revelation and feeling good about that rather than using it for outreach. So I got started on the project, and the reason I mentioned it and went back was simply because when I conceived of the project, I how do you start a project, and what are you going to do, and how are you going to create the website, and what are you going to say? And I came up with a little slogan for it, which was "Get a clue and follow it," or "Then follow it," I believe is how it specifically went. Get a clue, then follow it! Exclamation point. That pretty much sums up everything in a certain sense. That's what I've been doing, is following clues more than starting with some agenda. Things seem like they're going to happen. They don't always happen. Like, so for instance, with the UB the News project, I thought by getting a lot of documentation about the Urantia book's credibility that way, that it would be compelling enough to start to really change minds. When I look back on that, I think that was a misguided reasoning process, that in fact there's things beyond the truth getting out that are required in order to really change minds. If it was just a matter of people knowing the facts, what a wonderful world it would be. But we're not anywhere close to that. In fact, there's all kinds of things that get in the way. And so I came to realize that as valuable as the work is, it's not going to create some sort of avalanche of interest because of its compelling nature, and that there are other forces at play much bigger.
But I will say that from my perspective, I'm a younger generation, but I've done a lot of Urantia book outreach, and I see for the younger generation, my little segue into introducing the revelation is usually through ancient history. In particularly Anunnaki or ancient alien type of ideology, ancient astronauts, whatever it is, the foundation of mankind and the establishment of the first civilization. So I feel like that's kind of trending now too. So your body of work, while maybe it's not as grasping, perhaps because you think that maybe it's too intellectual or something like that, it seems that people are looking for alternative answers now more than ever, at least in my generation. And so it does provide value, all that body of work that's there. It seems the challenge, though, and this is perhaps with all Urantia book type of academic work, is marketing it in a way that is digestible for your average, everyday individual.
And sometimes it's just timing. And I think you raise a good point with all these comments, because one of the things related to that general outlook that you gave is that the body of work is there. It has its inherent value, and when and how it gets appreciated is yet to be determined. Things can continue to unfold, times can change, greater interest can start to be taken. And it is interesting. I was visiting with a friend today who had the unusual experience of writing a book 8 years ago, and in the last month getting larger orders than she's ever seen before, which is highly unusual. But it just goes to show you that it's possible, and things aren't always the timing that we think they're going to have, or they don't always show up that way. But it doesn't mean that the value isn't there. You can think about something like Sugar Man, In Search of Sugar Man. Remember Rodriguez?
I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, you never heard about Rodriguez?
No.
Oh, this is a outrageous human interest story. There's a great documentary about him. But back in, I guess it was the early 70s, very late 60s, early 70s, he produced 2 albums that didn't go anywhere in the United States. But in South Africa, they were absolutely revolutionary albums that people powerfully related to and considered integral to the whole political change movement of ending apartheid. Mm-hmm. And the people of South Africa thought he was dead. They had received false information that he had died on stage or killed himself or something like this. So it went on for decades that he was just a top-selling, best-known artist in South Africa, but he knew nothing about it. His musical career went nowhere, and he went back to work doing manual labor his whole life till he was in his 60s or something at that point. And these people from South Africa found out he was alive. They searched it out, and it was this incredible story. And he went to South Africa and played concerts, for full stadiums of people, and and just went directly from manual labor to stardom, right? And it's phenomenal. You just never know when your contribution is going to be appreciated and how. I mean, it's one of the most remarkable stories on our planet that a whole nation could aggrandize someone, not realize he's still alive.
Yeah. I hear about that every once in a while, especially with artists. It's always usually the artists are people who prove to be prophets before their time, and then people look back and wow, this guy called it, but it's 100 years ago or whatnot. But
so things of value have a way of hanging around and finding their place in time, and so hopefully that work will have a bigger effect, but it still has an effect now. I get plenty of appreciation for it, and people use it even if it's not creating some exponential wave of interest. It still has its merits, and that's cool. But I mainly brought it up just because it was that get a clue and follow it mentality that so much applies to what we were talking about, the signs of the times, the eclipses, how that might relate to the Urantia book, and what does it all mean. And
well, let me ask
I don't know. I'm following clues and seeing where they go. And
well, as far as value and following clues, maybe can you tell us what's maybe the most intriguing thing that you've been annotating lately, or that is on your mind? Maybe what has been the most exciting thing? Or
well, that definitely is the most exciting thing that's been on my mind and that I've been annotating, and it's been expanding in certain ways that I can give some examples just to provide some flavor that way. So I kind of fairly recent, maybe, I don't know how many, 4 or 5 months ago, I think, posted a topical study called Prophecy and Signs of the Times. And that starts out talking about the eclipses, talking about the fact that the phrase signs of the times is only used twice in the Urantia book, and both times it's within quotes by Jesus. There's segments of it that relate to what we talked about before, Tenskwatawa. There's things related to Melchizedek and Adam and Eve and their possible potential return or inevitable return, however you may look at it,
right.
And how all of that relates to this topic and why. And that's a really important conversation there, because as many people are aware from Christian currents and the Urantia book, Jesus saying essentially no one in heaven or on earth can presume to say when I'll return. And people want to talk about that all the time anyways.
Right.
In Christianity, they, I think, want to talk about that all the time anyways, because there's nothing else to talk about, and it's just as intriguing a conversation as there could possibly be. So it's really challenging for Christianity to honor that. But with Urantia book teachings, we've got information about who Melchizedek was, his relationship to Abraham as a teacher is sending out of missionaries. One thing I haven't mentioned yet, but what do you know? According to the Urantia book, the 4,000th anniversary of Melchizedek's arrival on our planet is the year 2021, right in between the two eclipses.
Oh, wow.
Right. So naturally, that makes the whole Melchizedek angle a little bit more intriguing that way. And it is where we get discussion that possibly children of Adam and Eve would come back with him and do more genetic uplift. So there's the whole relationship there to our problems genetically that occurred because of the Adamic default, and how we've got problems that are beyond our ability to solve effectively.
Do you want to kind of clear the air with that? Because I know that there's a tendency that some people can label the Urantia book as racist, or geared towards white supremacy or something like that. If somebody hasn't really delved into it very far, it's quite easy to paint it with a broad stroke and just say this is racist and this is for these privileged type of people to keep their eugenics on this planet, and then compare it to Hitler and whatnot. So do you think maybe you could kind of help us out as to your interpretation of the genetics?
I would love to.
Thank you.
First thing to mention, just in terms of getting a comprehensive understanding, really in-depth understanding of what the Urantia book has to say, is on the ubannotated.com website. You can access the eugenics, race, in the Urantia book report, which I first published in 2011. It's over 100 pages long. It quotes extensively from the Urantia book, and breaks down all these different issues of controversy, and really focuses on the most controversial things that are said so that they can be addressed. So there's that broad and deep way to access information firsthand. And I, of course, can't recommend that enough, getting a real firsthand understanding of the text.
Right.
So there's that to start with. To go now beyond that and address how you raised the topic, what I want to say is one of the biggest challenges we have with this is just getting our terminology used effectively. It's not that I'm trying to tell the world how, we must define terminology. I respect that, people are free to do what they want that way, but we've got some problems right now, and that is that it gets very difficult to understand when bigotry is intended and when it's not, because the word racist has evolved into a meaning that implies bigotry, hatred. It did not start that way. It started with an understanding that some people, through their understandings of science, felt that the genetics of certain segments of the population were superior to other segments. And that's not a hatred of other segments necessarily. It's just, looking at how things shake out and trying to define things in a quantitative way. And so certainly today there's ample evidence of how much this is a problem psychosocially, because IQ tests are denounced regularly by a significant portion of the population. That whole field of study has ideological ideological biases to it that are coming out that are very dangerous, really.
Right.
And really cruel, because in this sense, it's really quite a faux sense of well-intentioned humanitarianism to try to pretend everyone just naturally has the same intelligence across the board. And it extends from races to individuals. That's part of the problem. If you can't see it in racial differences, that's a foundation for not being willing to see it in individuals. and making excuses for that it's all just environmental nurturing.
Right, right.
This is incredibly unfair to people with lower intelligence to tell them they're not working hard enough and they could accomplish anything they set their mind to when they can't. It's just a cruel thing to say to disadvantaged people, and it's hard for me to watch it go down amongst populations of well-intentioned, educated, but terribly misdirected people, in my opinion.
Yeah, it seems a challenge of kind of understanding the difference between equality and sameness. You know, we have this tendency of we all are the same, and so that there's no hierarchy of sort of who's chosen over who. But you know, that's one of the beauty of this Urantia book, is that we learn that we're all chosen by God, you know, at least in a spiritual sense.
And as wonderful as that is, it's hardly necessary at all to suggest we need a fifth epical revelation to get this lesson and apply it at a macro level, because parents live this reality all the time when they have several children and they're not all the same. And parents love their children and recognize their differences, and no one says, oh, you're such a hater because you look at one of your children as not being as intelligent as another child, and you're not expecting as much of them, and you should expect just as much of all your children. People don't talk that way.
Right.
Because when we have a very real, hands-on, visceral, rubber meets the road, we're personally involved experience of all this stuff, what do you know? We become very smart about it.
Right.
You know, and filled with common sense and logic and good reasoning abilities. And so it's all right there in the context of a family. All the issues we're dealing with is that parents need to deal with loving the whole family as a whole and taking care of the family as a group. They need to relate to each child as an individual and love them all the same with the same love, but with respect to their individual differences. This isn't complicated. It's not an intellectual problem we're facing here.
Yeah, but at the same time, it is complicated. I mean, you know, we have our expectations. We have our human, you know, animal-like traits of pleasure seeking and problem avoidance and insincerity and, you know, equivocation. And I think, you know, something that we're hitting on here is equivocation. Equivocation is a big thing, you know, because it's usually because of X, then X, Y, and Z is real. So because the Urantia book mentions genetics, then it's racist, right? Like this notion of just because of a little ounce of truth or a little significance in your opinion, then the rest is true. And I think what you're trying to do here is kind of break down the intricacies in the depth of each concept, that it's more than something you can just paint in absolutism or just kind of a broad generalization of things, that this is going to take some thinking and some hard work and start as far as processing this information.
Yes, and because of all these self-interests but I think, you know, what we're doing is complicating something that's simple and that is readily understandable, because we're having trouble getting beyond our own self-interest in some ways. So we don't tend to talk straight about various issues. I don't know what it takes, but the Urantia book, really getting back to how it relates and people project things onto it that aren't there, is that we have generally the value of mixing the races, hybridization. The Urantia book speaks in favor of that. So interestingly enough, while people look at the Urantia book and criticize it for being quote unquote racist and promoting some type of racial superiority doctrine that would be to the detriment of certain groups in some way and all of this type of stuff, meanwhile, what it actually teaches is the eventual homogenization of the races into one race.
Right.
So that's a teaching that honors the distinct nature of races, even if there's quantitative differences between them. Because those variations, that's just a big old broad brush statement. In fact, genetics are filled with all kinds of nuances.
Okay.
Yeah, that we're going to have to come back and figure out how to bring these different traits together. And we understand this from, breeding animals, how genetics work. And the challenge is applying that to ourselves in a way that is uplifting and is honoring humanity. People get put off by making the comparisons to animals because we control animals, but human beings have their individual sovereignty. And so we have to deal with that spiritual aspect of it. And that's absolutely right.
Right.
But there's no problem with putting these two together, the science of genetics, which applies broadly across animals, and then integrating it with our unique spiritual endowment and figuring out a way to make the most of it. That's really not a big intellectual challenge or distinct from our experience or ability to talk about those ideas. But when we actually apply them on a human level, then it gets incredibly challenging because we as human beings don't know how to deal with overpopulation issues very well, separate from race. And this is just never talked about enough. We get so ahead of ourselves, and this is why it's so easy to disparage the Urantia book or anyone talking about racial issues, is culturally, the way I look at it, we get way ahead of ourselves with these issues. And we do that because overpopulation issues and managing population is a topic that is completely distinct from race. You don't have to bring up anything about race in order to recognize that those challenges exist for human culture and the progress of civilization. Now, let's ask ourselves, if we're having a challenge with that and haven't really figured out population issues, what's going to happen if we add race into the picture?
Right.
I mean, that's just going to make a terrible mess of it for obvious reasons. And that's what we've got. And so, to my mind, people want to bring up race issues. They're not ready to. If we want to work things out as human beings and figure out how we're going to come up with principles and ideas and understandings that are solid amongst us, that we are a real foundation, then we got to start at the beginning with those principles. And, start with the simple and get to the more complex. Start with the rule, then get to the exception. And so this is where I think
the focus on population is what's paramount.
Yeah, and we can't blame the Urantia book or anybody else for something like this. This is where we as human beings have to get extremely rigorous in our own conversations regarding problem solving and recognize that when we're talking about how different races are going to get along on this planet at this point in its history, as global as we've become with technology and travel and all these things and awareness and understanding, we've got to get to that level of how are people going to deal with limited resources and get along? How are we going to deal with the desire to have freedom of procreation as a natural right, quote unquote? I'm not saying it is. The Urantia book says there are no human rights. There's just mores that have evolved and developed, so long ago we don't remember exactly how they came up.
That kind of hints on this notion that I was talking about with previous guests is we're in this ideological struggle that is still hard for people to step outside of in order to maybe embrace outside of the box thinking like the Revelation, like the Urantia book. And, there's been all sorts of theories as far as what that ideological struggle is. And, there's all sorts of apocrypha and things like that, that it came out with the publication of the Urantia book. But personally, I can't help but reflect that this ideological struggle is this chosen personness. And I don't mean that in relation to specific groups, religious or racial or anything like that. I mean that just each individual has to ask themselves, what are they chosen for? This notion, am I chosen to serve or chosen to be served? And it was Jesus who said, may the greatest among you be the servant of all. So still, we kind of look at this text and the average person interprets it as to how is this serving me or how does this serve the popular opinion, instead of this real notion of embracing the spiritual realities that's below the surface of this material manifestation of information. And so how do we then have these signposts as to what to really pay attention?
Regarding that particular issue, interesting to note, I just sent out a UB the News email today where I listed a bunch of additions to the UB annotated website from July.
Okay.
And one of those is a film of an hour-long talk given by Jordan Peterson called The Meaning and Reality of Individual Sovereignty.
Interesting.
Yes, and I annotated that in the place in the Urantia book where the teachings of Jesus at Urmia are encapsulated in a section called Law, Liberty, and Sovereignty.
Right.
And one of the great points that he makes, and really just teases out the breadth and depth of it, is to say, what created this country, this notion that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We can beat up on that it says men and not men and women, or that there were slaves, and all of these issues that are significant. But there's a kernel there that goes right to the heart of the most general and the most important theologic concept, which is that we are equal before God.
Mm-hmm.
And that equality before God is what creates the foundation for understanding the spiritual sovereignty of every individual, of respecting them as a child of God that way, first and foremost. And one of the points he makes is that just because, they said we hold this truth to be self-evident, that doesn't mean everyone accepts it as self-evident and lives by it.
Sure.
And the alternative to that is what we see today with identity politics, that you are not first and foremost an individual. You are part of a group, and the politics of your group defines who you are, so and what is right and wrong.
Well, let me comment on that, because this idea of identity politics as a almost security blanket to stop individual chosen ideology of one person being greater than the other, but inevitably you shoot yourself in the foot in following that, because you lose the individual uniqueness of each individual and how valuable each individual is. And I always go back to the concept of true diversity is the celebration of individual uniqueness. That's true diversity, that we're all unique. And to throw someone in a category based on their eye color or their sexual preference or their gender or race or whatever it is, that's not valuing the individual. You know what I mean?
And what's so interesting is, and wonderful, and this is why the talk is so powerful in part, is because he really exposes the whole logic of the misdirected step that was made. That if you go in the direction of identity politics, then what goes with that is recognizing that there's numerous identities that each of us have invariably. We're male, we have a race, we have a nation, we have a religion, we have an occupation.
Sure.
And it becomes so complex that everyone ends up becoming their own identity political group. Right. And so it doesn't really work when you try to practically apply it, because invariably you have to deal with all these groups that really are important, and there's so much diversity. And
Yeah, yeah. And I personally, I go more for the sustainability principles, is that as humans, we all have a certain formula kind of that we need in order to thrive, right?
Yeah.
So like having an opportunity to learn, having opportunity to grow in self-knowledge, things like that, having the opportunity to find your gifts and then contribute to society, right? I think that's something that's innate in all of us as having a particle of the creator of all dwelling inside of us. We have this burning desire to contribute through creative enterprise.
And that is where it's at, and this conversation got started a little bit because there are people who are looking for an enemy. They're looking for something to hate or someone to hate, so that they can feel strong and right.
Right.
The conversation of bigotry is invariably, generally speaking, a polarizing conversation. You don't win friends and influence people who think differently than you by saying, "You're such a bigot, man. Can't you see that? You're just such a hater." Like, does this work? This doesn't work. What it's for is rallying a base.
Okay.
It's for really speaking to people who already agree with you so that they will feel strongly connected with you. It's not a peacemaking operation to speak that way. It's not a harmony producing
It's
modality.
polarizing for sure.
It's polarizing, and it's just that simple.
Right. Yeah.
So the good news is, if we don't do that, what we're left with is we really got to discuss the issues. We can't just retreat into, "You're a hater."
Yeah. Well,
And we have to really, as Jesus taught and the Urantia book teaches in all kinds of ways, really get to know people.
yeah.
Find out what's driving them. How did they get there? What are their values, and so forth. And then build on the values that are there and work to enhance them in such a way that it crowds out, the problems or the perceived problems.
Sure. Yeah. And that's why I feel like the teachings in the Urantia book, and particularly the teachings of Jesus, kind of are the remedy for this polarizing effect in our current quality of thinking. I personally feel like we have an opportunity here, those of us who've been privileged with certain information, to uplift the quality of thinking on this planet, and it's challenging for me to see the trending nature of this quote unquote intersectional politics, intersectional social politics on a religious platform. So like, I want to ask you the question of, how do you feel as far as what our challenge is, humans want to deal with this provocative nature of politics and race and all this stuff. And here we have organized religions that might be out of knowledge to share. And so they're taking on these trending topics, and, it's things that we're going to have to get courageous with and work out. But at the same time, there's the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of man, and it doesn't always reflect that way. They don't always equal, especially on this planet.
Well, there's great reasons not to politicize one's religion, and there's important reasons why theology has a profound influence on one's politics. And so the way to overcome that challenge, I think, is well exemplified in our founding documents, where it just says, we hold this truth to be self-evident, that we're equal under God. Okay. It just doesn't go any further than that. Very simple kind of gospel message. Very foundational, simple message that sets the structure of relationship. Once that's done, then we're really, fortunately, thank God, at liberty to discuss our politics free of any type of theological association, and just get right to meanings and values, and speak from a value-based perspective, and try to reason with people. and do that human job in the human way. And I think this is where, the Urantia book makes a great point in saying you don't have to have faith in God to be a great political leader. You can do it without that. But if you've got that, you should at least be able to measure up to the qualities of someone who doesn't have faith.
Right.
And part of that is recognizing, like your brother without faith, that bringing religion into it isn't necessary to be great in political leadership.
Right.
In fact, it's
Well,
Well,
okay, so then let's riff on that with this notion of, with our current president. There's a lot of concepts of people think that this is of a religious nature why we are where we are and the timings that we're in and with our political leadership and whatnot like that, And there's camps that are split with saying that, the current president is of divine chosenness to be put in his position. And then there's some who just want to look at it as, the mob won or something like the mafia, the criminal syndicate won too. In me, I always take a central stance. I'm pretty neutral. I'm a centrist, I guess you could say. I always kind of argue for the spiritual realities of things and the sustainable principles that we all adhere to. But what's your perspective on that?
Even the prophets of old taught that the Most High's rule in the kingdoms of men. It's only natural to conclude that if there's a living God, that living God has some relationship to how things are going down on this planet. So I'm not at all cynical or, suggesting that it's wrong-headed to entertain ideas about how God works in the world with respect to government and politics and the transition of things that relate to the growth and meanings of values and the advancement of civilization. The problem comes when we're in the political arena trying to do politics and we bring that into the conversation. And not respecting when we're in what kind of conversation and what's appropriate and why. So if you're looking to get your candidate elected or whatever, and there's a strong religious relationship to that candidate, you can leverage that.
Right.
It doesn't make it right.
Right.
And the evidence that it doesn't make it right is the recoil that you get from the other side,
Right.
which could be avoided by saying something else about the candidate that's more positive, factual, less controversial in the sense that it's related to material reality, not spiritual beliefs,
Right.
And have a political conversation. I can't, control other people. You can't. People will make mistakes. Sometimes I'll make those mistakes and find politics and religion in a way that isn't useful. It's easy to fall in that trap. That's why we have teachings about it, because we need them. It's really, really challenging. So I just think all we can do is be vigilant in terms of trying to raise the frequency of the conversation, trying to not respond to the misdirected aspects of it, but instead see what's below that needs directed well and can relate to value propositions that are shared. It's often not hard to do it all, if we just have the presence of mind to step back.
And I look at our culture, and our culture definitely kind of reflects this notion of we want a superhero to come take care of everything for us and do it. Like, we need a hero, right? Not this sustainable leader. Kind of like you look at the balance of Jesus's personality, so well balanced. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't using equivocation as motivation techniques. He was incredibly sincere, incredibly poised in a way that speaks to sustainable development over time for each individual and community. Yet we have a tendency to marvel at the bright, shiny things. And it reminds me of how the ancient Hebrews had such a a problem in accepting Jesus as their Messiah because he wasn't fulfilling the Superman, Iron Man, superhero, firing lightning bolts out of every orifice and smiting the enemy. And I still wonder, you know, that's still part of these vestiges that we're struggling with in our society, that we can't separate the divine treasures and the material necessities, and what is proper leadership in that balance.
Well, yeah, the leadership issue is profound because we've got an absence of incarnate celestial leadership, and humanity is suffering tremendously because of that. And not surprisingly,
Right.
with that goes a lot of human leadership that leaves a lot left to be desired.
Right.
And so our efforts to find good human leadership is terribly undermined and thwarted, and we're frustrated as all get out. And the lack of celestial leadership, I think on a certain level, puts us in a position where we're all trying to be a leader. A bit too much. It makes it harder for us to appreciate human leadership because we're missing that broader reaching, unifying thing that makes us all equal. Like before Adam and Eve, we're all about the same.
Right.
Before the staff of 100, we don't really compare, do we?
Yeah.
So to have that missing from the picture has profound ramifications or consequences for the human psyche. But for us, it's like the air we breathe, so we don't hardly know how to think about how it's affecting us. But we can imagine what it would be like if celestial beings were incarnate on the planet and the world knew about it and everyone was on the same page that way.
Right.
I mean, that's just a radically different, profoundly shifted world.
Yeah, and it seems that what people are willing to agree on or accept is something in that vein, is that, the Zecharia Sitchin model of that beings came down here, created mankind in order to be slaves, to mine gold for them, instead of, the real account that we get in the Urantia book, which is this notion of proper administration taking its first steps towards civilization and teaching, proper steps of animal husbandry, fire building, shelter building, things like that. So again, I feel like the onus is on those of us with the privilege of this information to uplift the quality thinking and conversation in a way that takes the superstition out of it and sentimentality out of it, but then also presents such complex concepts like Adam and Eve, biological upliftment, beings from a different planet coming down here to help foster civilization, things like that. We have to explain that. We have to be creative enough in order to interpret these things and explain them in a way that people can get the medicine that they need, almost.
Well, I think I'd like to share 3 paragraphs from the Urantia book that
cool.
really will take us right in there. This is at 176.2.5, and Jesus is speaking. Okay, so these will be 3 paragraphs. The middle one is one of the 2 instances of when Signs of the Times is used. And it's used by Jesus in quotes here. So this is Jesus speaking. But the times of the reappearing of the Son of Man are known only in the councils of paradise. Not even the angels of heaven know when this will occur. However, you should understand that when this gospel of the kingdom shall have been proclaimed to all the world for the salvation of all peoples, and when the fullness of an age has come to pass, the Father will send you another dispensational bestowal, or else the Son of Man will return to adjudge the age. And now concerning the travail of Jerusalem, about which I have spoken to you, even this generation will not pass away until my words are fulfilled. But concerning the times of the coming of the Son of Man, no one in heaven or on earth may presume to speak. But you should be wise regarding the ripening of an age. You should be alert to discern the signs of the times. You know when the fig tree shows its tender branches and puts forth its leaves that summer is near. Likewise, when the world has passed through the long winter of material mindedness and you discern the coming of the spiritual springtime of a new dispensation, you should know that the summertime of a new visitation draws near. But what is the significance of this teaching having to do with the coming of the sons of God? Do you not perceive that when each of you is called to lay down his life struggle and pass through the portal of death, you stand in the immediate presence of judgment, and that you are face to face with the facts of a new dispensation of service in the eternal plan of the infinite Father? What the whole world must face as a literal fact at the end of an age, you as individuals each must certainly face as a personal experience when you reach the end of your natural life and thereby pass on to be confronted with the conditions and demands inherent in the next revelation of the eternal progress of the Father's kingdom.
Thanks for reading that.
So Jesus just said that it's a literal fact at the end of an age. That's a phrase. A literal fact at the end of an age. The world goes through like what an individual goes through when they die. And Jesus is talking about this in the context of getting a new bestowal, right? That this is the new changing of the guard of the time period and everything. One of the things that I think is very important to reflect on and just hold and think about is that the Urantia book teaches about dispensational resurrections as a reflection of how God loves us. It's, in a sense, what the whole book is about, is explaining how God loves us and why love looks like this. And one of the things we come to learn is that these periodic resurrections allow people to go through one of the most profound experiences of life, death, mortal death,
right,
and come out on the other side at the same time as their family and friends. Isn't that nice?
Yeah.
I mean, that's sweet. Okay. That's really sweet. But, and then there's exceptions to the rule. Sometimes people on the third day, if they advance a lot, right? You have the rule of love and then some exceptions to accentuate and enhance that general rule. In order to have that, now, of course, remember, like when that happens, a dispensational resurrection, that means literally you've got lifetimes being resurrected all at once, generations upon generations being resurrected. Big deal.
Right, right.
So like resurrecting a whole world at once is nothing in comparison to resurrecting a whole age at once, right? Mm-hmm. And as we know, people can die at any time, and we must always be prepared for it. And the universe is set up so whether we're a day old or 100 years old, or no matter how we die, where we're at in our spiritual development, it's all set up to handle it.
Right.
Right? So it seems to me that the Urantia book is teaching us, and Jesus is saying quite clearly, when a new bestowal comes, this planet will go through a judgment. It will be like, everyone dying at once. And how exactly that shakes out and who goes where, when, and how, and I'm not seeing enough information in the Urantia book,
right,
especially as it relates to our peculiar planet, to get too specific about that. But there seems to be something clearly going on here in terms of Urantia book teachings and just human, common sense appreciation for our world and the history of our religious traditions and all of it. That really kind of makes sense of all of this. Like, we need some superhuman help again. And when it comes in, it's at a particular place in the world, the way individualized expressions are, even if they're for a wholeness, it's going to change things dramatically. And what kind of, who stays, who goes, all that stuff. Like, there's all kinds of wild ideas about this that I imagine all have a kernel of truth to them somehow, and that's how they hang around.
Sure. Well, this kind of reminds me of something that, maybe you want to get into it, where you were just visiting, in Kansas. Mm-hmm. That, it's got a lot of the hallmarks of something that, the Urantia movement went through, dealing with Vern Grimsley and his influence in this culture's history and stuff. I know you want to kind of fill us into, there was some kind of changing of the time, some kind of divine intervention for prophecy that kind of snuck in there towards the end of his life, where there's this notion of World War III, Armageddon was coming. And I don't know if maybe you want to help make sense of that for us.
Well, kind of a big topic. I'm not sure exactly what to say other than in religious communities, they're particularly Christian religious communities that have these traditions and teachings about end times and worldwide problems. Like, that's just what's out there. Right. And people are trying to make sense of those teachings, and they're trying to have their inner prayer lives and worship and, work with the indwelling Spirit of God. The Urantia communities had various types of people say they're the new John the Baptist or predict end of the world type scenarios that are akin to what we hear about in the Christian traditions.
Sure.
You've mentioned one of them, Vern Grimsley, which he especially well known because he was such a charismatic guy who had a beautiful non-denominational ministry over the radio that was on things like the armed services, airways, and things like that, where he used a lot of uplifting messages from the Urantia book, but didn't use the Urantia book explicitly.
Right.
And so, and he started a community of people, and it had some issues with World War III that some of which got over-attributed to him. And my hesitation in talking about it too much is because it is a really misunderstood and challenging topic that way, that involves people, today who are still alive and active doing things.
Right.
And I just don't see where I'm going to have an angle for,
this notion that everyone's looking for the signs of the times, right? And here we are now talking about another sign with the eclipse and whatnot. And that this isn't something new, right? It's something that people have thought that they've been told about.
Thank you. That's a context I can work with. Okay. So one of the things I want to say about this is certainly to acknowledge that the conversation I'm bringing up is a squirrely, weird conversation that people don't like to talk about, and for all kinds of reasonable reasons.
Sure.
Yeah. And it bears mentioning why am I talking about it? And why am I type of person? All right, so I do research, but lots of people do Urantia book research. How come I'm especially focused on something like this? And I'll give you the psychosocial dynamics of that as best I understand it. I'm not a very big person. I'm a small person. I grew up like I was the smallest kid in my class. So for me, if might makes right, that's bad. That's really bad. We don't want that. Yeah. So we want right to be right. And the way we have that happen is people come to agreements, they talk about it, right? So the way to overcome the might makes right is to talk about things, but the problem is those involved with the might makes right mentality don't like to talk about those things that interfere with that expression of their power. peculiar position psychosocially where I have a strong interest in bringing up difficult conversations because I don't feel secure in the world unless things can be talked about.
Okay.
It's the things that can't be talked about that lead to people just asserting themselves physically. See, I noticed a relationship that way.
Okay.
So I found myself like, we got to be able to talk about the things that are really hard to talk about because otherwise it's bad for me.
Okay. Yeah. Otherwise, I get squashed. Yeah.
So that just sort of got quite generalized in my psyche. You know, that just basic how I grew up kind of thing. And so, not surprisingly, on the UB Annotated website, where I've got a list of topical studies, the first section of that topical studies page is called Controversial Subjects.
Yeah,
Right?
That's good. That's good.
So I've got material in that section called Abortion and Resurrection of the Unborn,
Oh, wow.
Creating a Urantia Book-Based Religion, Eugenics and Race, How are Superiority and Inferiority Used? Is the Urantia book gay-friendly? Prophecy and Signs of the Times.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
That's me coming at you.
You like to go there.
Right. So that's just how I operate on a very fundamental level. I didn't expect to be so interested in prophecy and signs of the times. Personally, as a human being, I have not gone through my life with an affinity for that subject.
Okay.
What happened was a couple eclipses showed up.
Okay.
And I've had this kind of meme in my life, get a clue, then follow it. And I'm asking myself, okay, I got a Urantia book that says about these dates in Jesus' life. I got a couple eclipses crisscrossing the United States, right where there's a 111-foot bald knob cross of peace by a bunch of interdenominational Christians, whose history, interestingly enough, has some very peculiar parallels to the Urantia revelation
Really?
itself. Oh, yeah. And so I'm just asking myself, like, how big a clue do I need to want to study something because, you know, it looks like maybe there's something there worth studying? Like, how, like, isn't that dramatic enough? Like,
Yeah.
would I be looking for more than that to
Yeah.
have a topic of interest? That's just, it's,
But I'm sure you've experienced natural blowback, you know, as far as people saying, hey, don't
Oh,
worry
yeah.
about that. Put that down. That's not important, you know.
Oh, I have. I've definitely experienced blowback from it, especially because I went out to the Bald Knob Cross of Peace on August 21st, 2017 to view the eclipse and hope that Melchizedek or whoever else might show up.
Right.
I had hopes, you know. I said to everyone back at that point, I'm looking at this as a 7-year period. I hope something dramatic gets started at the beginning of it, but,
Right.
you know, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm going to enjoy an eclipse either way. It's a rare phenomena, and there's going to be a bunch of interdenominational Christians there who want to share the experience, and I get to tell them about the Urantia book and the eclipses and all this stuff. So it seems like a good party, you know, like that's just fun. So I went for that. But doing that most certainly attracted criticism that I was over the edge with my interpretations of the Urantia book and the Times, and that that's unhealthy and problematic. And so we should talk about like why, you know, why is that the case? And it's the case because if people develop beliefs about such things, they may act on them. Just right.
Sure.
And those actions, if they're wrong, then, you know, lead to mockery or from
Ridicule
others,
and embarrassment.
from others, and personal loss and embarrassment for oneself.
Right.
Right. And this is life, like, is the first thing I want to say. And the attitude people have towards failures in this arena of life is just pure hypocrisy. And it's just wrong. And I'll tell you how it's wrong. It's like when people compete in the Olympics, all of them fail except one to get the gold,
Right.
right? They're just filled with failure and belief is what the Olympics is all about. People who believe in themselves and fail
Lots of disappointment.
all over the place.
Right. Right.
And in fact, human progress just by its nature is filled with this
More failure than
process of
success.
more failure than success. And when we're at our best, we recognize that that's all part of the process and honor it.
Sure. Sure.
But there is an awful human tendency if people fail at something scientific, something medical, something sports-wise, to mock those who believed in themselves and failed, who thought they were right, but they were wrong. That mocking comes typically from people who aren't even trying to do something.
Armchair quarterbacks.
Right, because the
Armchair
people who,
quarterbacks, yeah.
are really trying to do something are more sensitive to the process and the challenges.
Sure. Sure.
But at any rate, that's life. And I just think it's important to acknowledge that. I came out of the experience with a disappointment that I found enriching. It was terribly disappointing, right? Disappointing.
Yeah. You were expecting to see something more?
Expecting,
Hoping?
It's all in that range. I don't know, like I'm trying to figure out what might be true and to act in accordance with it in some way where there isn't very good instruction and clear,
Right.
conclusions to reach. So sure, there's hopes and expectations involved to degrees. I said to people, I feel like about 60% sure that
Certain
we're going to
about
get
this.
started on the early side of it rather than the later side. It bears mentioning, at that time, I wasn't even yet conscious of the fact that 2021 would be the 4,000th anniversary of Melchizedek's arrival on Urantia.
Do you have a specific date for that?
No, we don't have a date for that.
Okay.
We just have it said that he arrived 1,973 years before Jesus. And from that, we can do the math.
Right.
That's all we got. So with the other things I've learned since 2017, it seems more likely maybe Melchizedek in 2021, but who knows what date or whatever. If I was just going to try to predict from the research I've done what might seem likely, I would say something like that now. Had I had this information back in 2017, maybe I would have said that back then. Who knows?
Okay.
But I didn't. And I had my ducks in a row and thoughts aligned with a less developed
Sure.
foundation in the research. Paid prices for it in certain ways and had, cool experiences in other ways.
Right. Right.
And I get ridiculed for it. It goes with the territory, and I think we just can't have it always. If you want to be cutting edge about anything, if you want to be ahead of the curve, are we going to be right all the time? And, where we're doing the most difficult aspects of human involvement with life that has the fewest people involved and the lowest probability of success and understanding, so there's a balance in life and I try to accept it and work with it. And, I dance at the end of the bell curve. That's where I play.
Well, I also appreciate that, you're trying to, work it out and disseminate and share this information without claiming to be the source of it. Like, it's not like you're saying, I'm speaking directly to God or to Melchizedek, and he's telling me that this is coming and you better believe me or else you're in default or whatever like that. You're actually trying to use tangible, real evidence to, tell the story.
I think this is a tremendously important distinction, and I'm really glad you brought it up because I sometimes get treated like
Channeling
something, right?
Right.
And it's very frustrating when that happens. And I understand because of the history of humanity why that energy gets spun up that way. And I try to be gracious with it, but it's hard, But that can happen, and it's just a natural consequence of swimming in those waters.
Yeah, I mean, I think whenever somebody's kind of starting to speak outside of the comfortability box, if that's even a word, is that, it brings up all sorts of things. And I think about, I'm reading in the Urantia book how it talks about when John the Baptist first showed up on the Jordan River baptizing people, that to repent for your sins in baptism was a new thing to the Hebrews. Like they never submitted to repentance before. The baptism for, the Gentile proselytes, that was one thing, to baptize them into the outer fellowship, the outer court of the fellowship. But the Hebrews themselves never had to go through this repentant submission process, And I don't know, I get this feeling that when people are asked to do something that they're not normally asked to do, or accept certain information that might be counterintuitive to a larger group think or something like that, that there's a fight that comes up, and it talks about that we're going to move along kicking and screaming, essentially, is the way that we're developing. And some things that kind of think of, like, maybe parents kind of set standards for their children that maybe the children don't quite understand, but then, or even coaches, and it's kind of paid off in the end. Now, that being said, we kind of have our own determination as to what we want to believe, right? And how we act and integrate that information, actualize it, and then act upon it. But at the same time, I think it's in our best interest to entertain outside of the box thinking, not to identify with it so much, but as to give ourselves intellectual exercises and see how we can look at everything objectively from such open-minded angles. I think that we do ourselves a better service to find those truths that we can foster in one another and lift those up, as opposed to immediately killing the messenger.
Yeah. I get what you're saying, and it's a side of the coin that was just a little bit the other side of it from what I was thinking as you were speaking, which was that kind of where the rubber meets the road with this stuff, on a, like, the living it level, not just intellectually. How do we really bring that forward in our lives?
Yeah.
And ground that. And
well, it seems that that's why people have such disdain for the supernatural, like spending too much attention on these supernatural things. A lot of people have the tendency to say, you focus on yourself, or focus on your material development, focus on that which is important, not all these signs in the times.
Well, the material part of it, see, that yes, that's really, I think, the point you just made it, is that when we get focused on that, when we have a project that we're trying to do in the world, that thought about repentance, at least for me, comes up pretty natural and easy. Because when I think about all the ways I could have done my project better, or I'm looking at all the ways I could move forward and feel like, I don't have all the answers, and I can see, that there's always room for improvement, or more creativity, or better ways of doing things, or something didn't work out quite right. And
sure.
And so I think it's like when we engage life that way and get out of our heads, like the being in our heads is important, because this is where we can start to think consistently, come up with ideas to express to others, and get on the same page, But it's really that, as I was saying, like the rubber meets the road. Like when we get involved with projects, then that's when our humanity shows up to us and others real quick.
Right.
Right. And it's kind of funny that way. So, that's what I noticed with my project, and the blowback and how that goes. And I'm not unique that way. It's not like poor me. That's just what happens,
Yeah.
And when people are really involved with something, then they're open to criticism. When they're doing something in the world, they know darn well they're not just a talking head. They're not just armchair quarterbacking something.
Right.
And it brings a level of reality and maturity generally to the situation that's, really valuable. And so I think, that may be sort of like the solution is involvement.
Yeah, I agree with
right?
that.
Because then we really have to face, and we're not just in our heads. You're like, get involved and get related. And
yeah, well, that's part of the concept that I had with this production studio. It's like create a environment where other people can contribute their creative involvement.
And it'd be great for me to hear more about what you're trying to do here. You told me we're just going to sit down and riff, and that's what we've been doing. It's gone all over the place, and
Yeah,
that's fine
I
with
enjoy
me.
that. I enjoy that.
But I don't know as much about your vision for this as I would like to. And so if you want to share some of that, I am really personally curious about that. You know, how
Sure,
you
sure.
see this developing and what you're trying to accomplish with it. So then I could relate to it better, I'm sure.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you know, it's not like this is a rehearsed presentation or anything like that, but as I mentioned earlier, I feel that for me, at least, I feel like I have a responsibility to contribute to this society by helping uplift the quality of thinking on this planet. And a lot of that is developing culture, you know,
Right.
letting people kind of allowing them the opportunity to see that it's okay to be a certain way, and it's okay to speak of things that are spiritual, and it's okay to be part of a culture that, you know, does believe in Jesus's mission, and, you know, all things that are outside of that, this like social norm, but not in a way to be provocative, just in allowing, I would say, a safe zone for those who are religionists, right? In this heavily atheistic society, a way that people can own the fact that, you know, we're not privileged with the opportunity of seeing divinity with our own eyes, but we can feel it, and we can acknowledge divinity's presence and work with divinity here in our own personal contribution. And I just want to really help develop a culture that reflects that. And if that means that maybe I go first doing it and asking these questions and developing a creative platform for other people to contribute and highlighting the works of, you know, people like you and others who have done things that are contributing to the quality of thinking on the planet. So my notion of this is to just be able to reflect things that are happening through the revelation that are happening in society, in real life. And then also like linking empirical findings like you're doing with UB Annotated and things like that. I also like having these creative broadcasts like we're doing right now, opportunities to talk to people who are doing cool stuff that most people don't know about. And I like to showcase those of us who have maybe actualized the teachings of the Urantia book and then apply it in the field and are actually doing things to contribute to the quality of thinking on this planet again.
Right.
And allowing that to be broadcast so that people can actually not be embarrassed about these concepts. You know, some of the things that we've talked about is pretty taboo in common society. The notion of Adam and Eve, genetics, you know, signs of the times, rapture, apocalypse, all these things. But I feel like we're privileged with this revelation that we can kind of talk about it in a practical sense, in a way that it's not so dogmatic. It's not so, I don't know, part of the old world, but yet it does touch on the truths of the old world. So for me, I'm just trying to create culture if I can.
Well, one of the things that that brings up for me is someone who's engaged in the same process, but through different media, right?
Right.
Is it makes me wonder when some podcasts are going to come along that I want to annotate. That's where
really?
my mind goes.
How do you foresee that? What would that look like?
Right. And so that definitely is what I want to share with you and give you some feedback on. You noticed earlier I mentioned about annotating the Jordan Peterson video where he talks about the meaning and reality of personal sovereignty and how the way he addressed those issues related to teachings in the Urantia book. So I put a link to his video at that place in the text. Similarly, I have linked to all kinds of things that Urantia book readers have done in a scholarly way that are either just cross-referential within the Urantia book itself and or related to things beyond the Urantia book. Whatever's interesting. That's one of the nice things about UB Annotated as a project that distinct from UB the News. UB the News was very narrowly defined about new discoveries and advances in science that support the history in the Urantia book. But UB Annotated is about everything interesting regarding how the Urantia book relates to our lives in the world around us.
Cool.
Whatever does the expansion of thought and the elevation of meaning and values, as you talked about being the essence of this project. That's what UB Annotated is now as a website that has annotations to the text and topical studies and things of that nature and reports and so forth. So it really tickles my mind about what kind of interviews you might come up with, because you seem, focused on those things that do interrelate the text to the world, and it's gravitating in that direction for you a lot. And that's definitely an area that's most interesting to me. I mean, I love the interreferential cross-study stuff, but even more, I seem to enjoy how all this incredibleness within the Urantia book itself then relates to the world, and
it's
kind of double the
fascinating.
fun that way and bring it all together. And
The other thing I think that's important is like what you're talking about is like maybe annotating some of these podcasts, because right now the only representation on, like, let's say YouTube or other places on the internet, they kind of like try to debunk the Urantia book. They're kind of just on a superficial topical sense. They don't read the book. They just go by kind of maybe what's on Wikipedia or whatever, and then try to smash it. Right. But here I kind of feel like it's important that the people experience, people like us and others who are just kind of like actualized it into our everyday life, where it isn't such a taboo thing, and like we've actually walked the walk.
And one of the things I'm hoping to help bring people in that way is that, because riffing can lead to long conversations that aren't clearly focused, but touch on a lot of important topics that, where the conversation may go for a few minutes or so. If you're able to give me clips of gems in conversation that relate very specifically to a topic, then that's the type of thing I can annotate well, and that people appreciate. To have people read through the text, and I've got this footnote. Well, somewhere in this hour-long talk, you're going to find some really, that doesn't quite cut it the same way.
Need bites.
Maybe there's ways to set up the links and so forth, so it would take people directly to a certain segment of the video. I don't know what technologically is the answer, but I bet there's a solution to our problem one way or another. And so that's very interesting to me. And I look forward to trying to work with you that way, because I think this brings study of the Urantia book to life, like literally. Just being online and reading stuff is great. It's its own fun, and it certainly can be shared with others, but this allows us to get to know each other more, and that's crucial. It really is crucial. The Urantia book is such a heady intellectual thing by its nature. The getting personally related part can sometimes get lost in all of it.
Yeah, there's the need to think alike.
Right. But, podcasts bring faces to the words and gives an interaction that brings life to it that I think is going to enrich our whole experience.
I feel like that's part of one of my goals, is to kind of celebrate the personalities that are doing what they're doing and have done what they've done, but in a light that isn't so, self-absorbed or aggrandizing the materialness, the superficialness of it. It's just more of being objective in the fact that, hey, this is happening and people are doing this. And so it's not that obscure. So that being said, I appreciate what you're doing, and, it's time to wrap up, unfortunately, but this has been awesome. You're invited to come back anytime.
Thank you.
And we're really looking forward to all the work that you're doing, and please share, let's collab as much as possible, and be in touch. And thanks for joining us, man.
Thank you very much. It's been great to be here, Derek.
All right. And thanks for joining us on The Spirit of Truth. We will see you next time. Thanks again, Halbert. God bless. Thanks, man. That was awesome.
Thank you.